and very warm welcome to everyone who's joining in. Fabrice, it's an absolute delight to co-organize this with you. Thank for that. In particular, I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to our panelists here today. We're going to provide their insights, their expertise and insights on the topic of today's STR session. I would like to thank very much Sue Cohen for joining in, Jonathan Dahl, Greg Fisher, and Aseem Kaul for making the time to share insights on their work, insights on the very topic of today. I'd like to thank everyone for the great number of folks joining in. The topic of today is obviously on publishing phenomenon-based research in STR and strategy. Really excited to be able to do this together. What Fabrice has said, I think the main aim, obviously, of today is to get key insights from our panelists on this very topic. The intent is that there's going to be presentations from each of the panelists. There's going to be room at the very end for any Q&A that you may wish to bring forth. Please do also know that the session is being recorded for sharing post the live session, such that the insights will be available via our STR YouTube channel, which is also frequently attended and well looked at. So it's very exciting to be able to host this session. I guess my question to all the participants is, first of all, once again, great to have such big numbers joining in. Please also know that there is an opportunity for you to use the chat box, such that we can keep track of any questions, thoughts that you may wish to share during the session. So please do not hold back on that. That doesn't mean that all of these questions and thoughts can be picked up on real time, but we do really find that a very useful extension of the session, and any important issues that we can pick up on will be picked up on by the panelists and/or ourselves that as moderators. And that will attend to that as well. So please make use of that. Without further ado, I'd love to hand over to you, Fabrice.
All right. Well, thank you, Koen, and thank you everyone for being here today. So before presenting our speaker, let me briefly introduce the topic and why in the first place we were interested in organizing this session on publishing phenomenon-based research in strategy. So first, what do we mean by phenomenon-based research? Phenomenon-based research focuses on identifying, documenting, conceptualizing real-world events or facts in nature or society to drive knowledge creation. And phenomenon-based research focuses on the phenomenon, as the name indicates. And actually, when you look at most top management journals, we have seen like calls and encouragement to publish more phenomenon-based research, especially, they recognize the specific opportunities, the specific insights associated with phenomenon-based research, especially in comparison with theory-driven approaches. So as you can see here on the slide, we have seen calls for more phenomenon-based research in AMJ, AMR, JIPS, and many other good journals. Okay. So some specific features of the phenomenon-based research. So the real-world phenomenon is a primary source of insights and knowledge, with theory ultimately aiming to better understand the phenomenon and not the other way around. So with phenomenon-based research, you have really like a priority on the phenomenon itself over theory, with the primary objective of achieving a deep understanding of the phenomenon. However, it also presents some challenges, especially in terms of clear definition, consideration of boundary conditions, also like focusing on specific aspects of the phenomenon. So despite increasing interest in phenomenon-based research, I think we still have like a need for more guidance, especially in strategy, how to publish good phenomenon-based research in strategic management, and how to conduct this kind of research. So to address these questions, we have invited four well-published scholars. So I'm delighted to introduce first Sue Cohen from the University of Pittsburgh. Sue's research is especially well known in terms of innovation, commercialization strategies. We have also Jonathan Dahl from Villanova, Jonathan's research especially centers around international business, trade, corporate responsibility. Greg Fisher from Indiana University, and Greg's expertise is especially in entrepreneurship. And we have also Aseem Kaul from the University of Minnesota. And Aseem's research is especially well known in the field of non-market strategy and CSR. So the way we have organized the session is around like three main different parts: the past, the present, and the future. And I will ask each participant to react in a few minutes, like about 3 minutes for each question. So if you as a participant, you have some questions, some comments, some concerns, please type that in the chat box and we'll have time for Q&As at the end of the session, okay? So my first question is for the panelists, what has been your experience publishing phenomenon-based research? And in particular, can you share a major benefit and major challenge you have had in publishing phenomenon-based research? So we'll go in this order. Sue first, then Jonathan, Greg, and Aseem. So Sue, if you would like to start and share your slides.
Sorry, this toolbox is in the way of my. Okay. Okay, so I'm very excited to hear what the other panelists have to say. For me, publishing phenomena-based research is really still a work in progress, but I've had a lot of involvement with it through working with AMD. As you probably know, the journal was founded specifically to be an outlet for research that is exploratory in nature and really is consistent with the definition of phenomena-based research that you provided. The theory is used to inform our understanding of the phenomena rather than the other way around. So what I would like to do is provide you with some context. I'll describe the past as I experienced it. Slide, there we go. The past in terms of my training in research as a scholar, and then moving towards where I think we are right now and where we're certainly heading in the future, which I think is very consistent with the mission of AMD. So my background, I was trained as a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota, which was a wonderful place to be as a doctoral student. I would say there was a dominant approach. We were told there's a three-legged stool of research. Yes, there's a phenomena we want to understand, and that's important. Something that's important to managers, to our understanding of organizations, and for me, our understanding of how organizations compete. And you have to be really good at least one leg of that stool. But it was, you could see by the font size, which was the most important leg in that stool. And ultimately, if you had nothing to say to a particular body of theory, then there was no real value added of your research. Method's important to establish your contributions to theory rigorously, but context was kind of a quiet voice. Towards the end of my stay at Minnesota as a doctoral student, the Zahirs arrived, and Shri was always the loudest voice in the room. But you have to understand your context. You have to understand where you're observing the phenomena in order to really inform theory. And I think that's where the field has moved. So she was very prescient at that point. But understanding the phenomena was sort of secondary to the theory. We had a lot of debates about rigor versus relevance, and that versus is really important because I think that's also a shift that we see in phenomena-based research when it's well done, is that trade-off really no longer exists. But at the time, rigor meant we are doing theory for the purpose of being able to develop generalizable insults. That's generally through using a body of theory that exists, using deduction to generate hypothesis, to test hypothesis. That's filling some sort of gap in our theoretical understanding of that phenomena, of a situation in which it doesn't apply, boundary conditions, and whether our research is providing useful insights or not is based on how rigorous our methods are. So pretty standard positivist criteria. Relevance was sort of nice to have, but if that's your driving concern, it's probably you're not really doing science. That was, pretty widely shared received wisdom at the time. On the other hand, through this hypothesis deduction, theory testing approach to extending the theories that we use to understand organizations and strategic management, we are supposed to arrive at a counterintuitive finding. So this was the challenge, I think, that still exists if you're trying to develop theoretical insights that will tell us something about a phenomena, and you're trying to balance criteria of validity with something that is counterintuitive and challenges the insights that existing theory provides. That's a really difficult challenge. So I think where we're going, that's become an easier quest, because that context voice, as you'll see, will start to get louder. So this is the past. Research is about producing publications. Often it's about producing whatever somebody's A-list of journals are. And so you really get into sort of the structure and the methodology of writing papers and conducting your research, or at least reporting your research in a way that has a standard hypothesis testing approach. And so if you learn something really useful about the phenomena, that's great, but that wasn't what motivated the research, and it's not what the value of your research was typically evaluated on. So that's my past.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Jonathan, please.
Yes, first, thanks, Fabrice. Thanks, Koen. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you here. So when I think about the past, I believe that the contemporary discussions around phenomenon-based research are really in part a reaction to several decades of business management scholarship becoming more and more obsessed, some would even say fetishized theory. And this goes all the way back to the Ford and Carnegie reports, which were critical of business education for being too practical and hands-on. And I think what happened is that we swung too far in the other direction, partly because our field is very much derived from allied social science. And I feel like we were trying to, in some ways, to out-theorize our sociology and economics and psychology colleagues. And so in the past couple of decades, we've seen a lot of self-reflection and criticism from Mintzberg and Goschal and others. And so I think this discussion about phenomenon-based research is really in this context of wanting to return to discovery and research that has some practical sort of real-world value. And so for my own part, the way that I came to phenomenon-based research was both because of my professional background as a trade negotiator, but when I took over the Journal of World Business in 2014, I think this was almost like the pinnacle of some of this criticism and reflection about kind of moving too far to theory-based research. I penned an editorial called "Why We Need Phenomena-Based Research in International Business." And so that was me kind of joining the conversation around this kind of turn. And I think, I don't want to get too much into the present because we'll go there in a moment, but I think it's been a very positive development over the last, say, decade or so. And I'll just mention one initiative that I was a little dismissive of initially, but I think has really taken off, and that is the responsible research in business and management movement that Anne Sui and others started. And to them, responsible has kind of two pieces to it. One is being responsible in the way that you conduct research, but also responsible in that you're offering something to society above and beyond what may be some of our narrow measures of performance. And so I think we are coming into a real renaissance of phenomena-based research. But I will stop there because now I'm moving from past to present. So thanks again for including me in the discussion, and I look forward to the continued conversation.
Thanks, Jonathan. Greg, please.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's great to be part of this discussion. So I've got a few slides, and I've spent a little bit of time reflecting on the questions that you posed, and certainly the one about history is intriguing to me. I came into this sort of profession, if you will, or into academia a little later in my career. I had spent time as a consultant and as an entrepreneur, and when I came in, I was quite surprised by the sort of intense fetish with having to anchor everything from a theoretical standpoint. And when I reflected a little bit on some of the impactful research from the past, be it from alternate spaces or from in management, I was quite surprised that, in fact, focusing on phenomena has actually been very productive for many people in the past. If you go back to Darwin and understand how he came up with the theory of evolution, was largely about looking out at what was happening in the natural world around him, and cataloging and understanding that and immersing himself in the real world, so to speak, that the theory was able to evolve. And so the sort of dichotomy, as I thought more about this dichotomy between theory and phenomena seem to almost not exist. Then one of the fascinating, you read any of Carl Weick's work and papers, I would argue he was actually, he's probably one of the most prolific management theorists that we've had, but a lot of work that he's done has been anchored in phenomena. And you go back to his Mann Gulch disaster paper, it's essentially focusing on a very specific incident, which you could frame as a phenomenon, and explaining or unpacking and using that as a basis to both understand existing theory more intricately and then extend out and elaborate that theory so that we understand it better. And so I for one, began to say, well, this sort of a notion of always starting from a theoretical standpoint may not be the most productive. And for myself, I think I've taken projects from different standpoints, but the ones where I've anchored in a phenomenon as a starting point, I'm both encouraged and inspired by that work in terms of keeping it going and so on. And so and also as I reflect on it, I just reflect how much I enjoyed these projects. So one of them, which was published in AMR, started from the notion of being just very interested in communities, and it evolved to being online communities, and then anchoring or elaborating on online communities and why they might provide firms with certain kinds of advantages. And then another was being intrigued by the sort of emergence of crowdfunding. And that led to two projects, both published in Organization Science, that are both really phenomenon-based or starting with the phenomenon. And so as I reflect on these past projects, I've got 5 things that I've taken away from the experience of publishing them, and I'll just reflect on these 5 things and then wrap up with my sort of reflection. And so the first is with the projects I've engaged in, this whole notion of going deep or experiencing the phenomenon as much as possible has been incredibly valuable. So in terms of thinking about communities, and even though I'm writing for AMR, so there's no sort of empirical data, spending time in communities, online communities, engaging, immersing myself in it, in the crowdfunding space, actually funding, speaking to people who were using that. So getting really, really deep and anchoring in the phenomenon was just so important as a starting point. The second is that I think phenomenon-based research, when we try and rush it, we often do a disservice. So partly because some phenomena come and go, and if all we're trying to do is explain flash in the pan ideas, we don't necessarily land up telling a story that has resonance and that has persistence and that can contribute back to theory. But if we stick with a phenomena that seems to persist for a longer period of time, I think we get more insight and perspective and are able to talk to it more. And so I've always alluded to this idea of the slow hunch around following a phenomena and being slow and patient in truly understanding it. And so immersion and patience really go hand in hand in some respect. I ultimately think you've got to get back to some kind of theoretical perspective. And I found it very useful to experiment with how I was interpreting and understanding phenomena. So testing interpretations with different target audiences. And the question, what is this a case of, which I got from Jerry Davis, I think is an extremely useful question to keep asking yourself as things emerge, so that you are tying it back to some extent to theory, utilizing theory to help understand what's going on, and then contributing back to that theory. And so this sort of notion of experimentation and testing interpretations, both at, for me, it's been certainly useful to do so at brown bag sessions, in conference presentations, in discussions with other scholars, but then also with your audience who are embedded in that phenomena, and see whether they resonate with some of the things you're understanding or saying. So in my case, it was with crowdfunding backers, with people pitching projects on crowdfunding platforms and so on. The fourth thing is to not be scared to iterate. I think getting too locked in to a theoretical perspective to understand a phenomena too early can be problematic. And then everything you just start to see through one lens or one perspective. So be open to alternatives, especially as you test with audiences different interpretations or understandings of what's going on. And in my case, it's been very valuable to be open to reviewers' interpretations, understandings, promptings, pushings, because ultimately you do want to get this research published. And if you can start to work with reviewers, and I've had to eliminate things, drop ideas, pull in other ideas. My community-based paper, I've always wanted it to be focused on communities generally, but they pushed me to say online communities is where the action's at. And so that's where the paper landed up being at. And then the final thing I think is important is that phenomena are normally complex, especially in management and organizations. They've got a lot of moving parts. And if we try and explain everything in one foul swoop, you often land up overcomplicating what you can contribute back to theory, or it just becomes too unwieldy to make any kind of contribution. So I've come to the conclusion that we often need to leave ideas, insights, perspectives on the table. Think of it as slack that you can use for another paper in the future or for another discussion going forward, or to extend that line of research, but not everything can land up in one paper. And often it's about picking and choosing and being willing to say no to certain things and leave things on the table. So that's my perspective of my own personal experience of trying to do this as someone who's sort of dabbled in it and hopefully allowed it to evolve to some extent.
All right, thanks, Greg. Aseem, in 3 minutes, please.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me, and thanks to Fabrice and Koen for organizing this. I'm a big fan of this kind of, I'm going to call it non-hypothesis driven research, because I think there's a lot of different things out there. And, I've been a big fan of that for a while. I was looking, as Greg was talking, I was doing the math, and I think I've published 14 large sample empirical papers, and I think about 8 of them don't have hypotheses. So, so I'm going to try to answer the 2 questions that I was asked, right? So I think the big benefit to me has just been, I think, really the ability to be honest and clear about what you're trying to do, right? And that's sort of personally rewarding, because it allows you to really focus on what's important to you, rather than, trying to make up some theory or trying to find some hook to some connection to some theory. It's also really valuable, I think, in the review process, because it means you don't have to deal with, you're going to get reviewers who are, or hopefully you're going to get reviewers who are actually interested in the phenomenon that you're looking at, or at least are receptive to the phenomenon you're looking at, rather than getting people who don't care at all about the thing you're studying, but are only interested in some theory, right? So I'm trying to solve climate change, or I'm trying to address toxic emissions, and I've got reviewers who are sitting there saying, oh, but you're misinterpreting stakeholder theory, and this is not exactly the definition. Who cares, right? Like, I want to deal with toxic emissions. I don't want to deal with, like, whether it's instrumentive or normative or whatever the hell else is, whatever flavor of stakeholder theory you happen to. I think there's like more flavors than Baskin Robbins. Anyway, so I think that's really the advantage. I think the disadvantage, the big challenge, I wouldn't say it's a challenge, and then this goes back to, I think, Sue's presentation. I think we are still very much as in our PhD programs, training people to be good at developing and testing hypotheses, right? That's how we approach papers. That's how we're trained. That's what we do. And that's the kind of papers that we're used to reading and writing. And when you try to write a different kind of paper, I mean, doing this kind of work requires you to sort of fundamentally shift how you think about things, right? And I think that shift is hard, both because one, you don't have good exemplars of papers to work on. So, you're often struggling to say, how should I organize my paper? But even more fundamentally, the kind of conclusions you can come to from phenomenon-based research are very different. You didn't start with a hypothesis. You can't come back and say, "Oh, my theory is supported." You didn't have a theory to start with. How can your theory be supported, right? You're not hypothesis testing. It doesn't matter how many stars are in front of your coefficients. So I think we really need to. You're trying to come up with the best possible, the most plausible explanation from the data that you've looked at. And that's not a test of a theory, it's a proposal of a theory that other people need to test. And so I think making that switch. And the last thing I'll say is I think the third challenge is I think we're, again, very conditioned to try to fit everything and come up with one coherent story where everything sort of fits, and anything that doesn't fit gets left out on the cutting floor. But in some ways, if you're trying to study phenomena are messy. Reality doesn't fit neatly into a box. And what's interesting about studying phenomena is the ability to say, hey, I find different things in different contexts. So I find some things work, some things don't work. And sort of being transparent and explicit about that can be really challenging, because it feels like, oh, I'm all over the place, and reviewers can come back and say that. But I think you want to embrace the messiness of reality rather than trying to sort of, hide it under the rug. And I'm going to stop there.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for all the first set of insights. And by the way, I remind all the participants, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we can come back to your questions after the presentation. So now let me turn to the second set of questions I have for the panelists. Share my slide to show you the question. So what are the state-of-the-art approaches to address the challenges of publishing phenomenon-based research, like in terms of best practices or recommended approaches you may have especially for the audience? So Susan, please.
Sorry, sum of question 2 is incorporated into my answer to the third question, looking ahead. I think at present, we're seeing a lot more calls for phenomena-based research. I certainly see that at University of Pittsburgh school-wide. There are a lot of grant opportunities that are specifically motivated by the need to understand some grand societal challenge. And as our organizers have pointed out, a lot of really smart people have written papers urging more emphasis on phenomena-based research. So why are we seeing that now? Why are we all having this conversation now? And I think some of it is threat-driven. We've all been exposed to debates in social media and credible media, that should have us reflect on how useful is the knowledge that we're producing, who's actually using this social science that we produce, and who believes what science tells them. That's been a topic of public conversation or public discourse anyway, over the last, 5 to 10 years. And it brings me back to one of the experiences I had. I think the first time I went to the academy, I paid a lot of attention to what are my seasoned colleagues presenting and how are people engaging with them in the audience. And I have these vivid memories of Carl Weick and Joel Baum they each started their presentation with a story. I mean, they just told this great story that immediately put you into a time and a place, and looking at some issue, some event, some situation from the perspective of some of the stakeholders engaged in that phenomena. And those were the presentations where the audience was just rapt, where you couldn't address all the hands that were up, because they understood, why is this research important? and they could relate to it. It was a very relatable way of talking about the research that they were engaged in. I've heard scientists criticized as we sound like we're trying to sell pharmaceuticals, right? If you've ever heard a pharmaceutical ad, there's this great benefit, but there are these 14 things you have to be concerned about. And we don't want to oversell what we've just learned, right? So we qualify it a lot. But I think part of what the call for more phenomena-based research is encouraging is to be able to tell a compelling story that is absolutely evidence-based, rigorously generated evidence, but there's a story that people can relate to and remember and see an application of. I think, again, echoing some of the things that all the previous presenters touched on, there are reasons why we need to be having this conversation, and we need to be seeing journals and universities change their incentive systems to accommodate on equal ground outlets for this type of research. Greg, you gave great examples of you can do it now, right? There's research out there that is phenomena driven and is already published. But I think I'll say a little bit more, and
okay.
some the other panelists already have talked about how to do this. So
thanks, Sue. Jonathan, please.
Thank you. I realize I didn't fully answer the questions in the first round, so let me take 10 seconds to answer the second part. Of the benefits of phenomena-based research to me are very simple. People actually read the papers. People actually read the papers. And I think I have both anecdotal and empirical evidence to support that. And I'm being a little flip here, but I really believe that when a research project relates more directly to something that people are experiencing and observing and reacting to, it is just naturally more attractive, and it piques curiosity, as Sue noted with Joel and others at this particular event, talking about stories as opposed to findings. In terms of state-of-the-art approaches, I think there are a lot of different opportunities. And to be honest with you, as an editor or reviewer, I would tend to be more exclusionary and critical of non-phenomena-based research. So as I see a paper coming in that is trying to fill a gap in theory, I'm immediately sort of at the edge of my seat on notice, wondering, does it do anything else other than that? And maybe just using Sue's example of a story, I really like research projects that begin with a real world anecdote to establish some face validity for what's to come. And when I see the absence of that, I'm wanting myself to find that anecdote, because otherwise I'm disinterested in the research. I'll also remark on something I know a little bit about Greg's research, and that is I think we have a lot of interesting events, many of them not necessarily positive events, but things that are happening in the context that allow us to use those events as either natural experiments or changes in context. And I do think as the strategy field and others have become more concerned about identification and mechanisms, that these natural experiments or quasi-experiments are very attractive ways to approach a real-world phenomenon in real time. And here I'm going to disagree slightly with Greg. I do think there's some advantages of being timely, even if we are not always 99.9% accurate. And I'll use the example of COVID. So when COVID hit, I think a lot of management scholars were wondering, what does this mean? What does this mean? At the time, I was general editor of Journal of Management Studies, and I proposed that we invite some short commentaries that try to speculate about what COVID might mean for different areas of management. And by management, I mean both the practice and the theory aspect of management. And as I look back on these, they were published a couple years ago. I think those authors mostly got it right, although I agree with Greg that we're going to have to let many years unfold before we know for sure. And I'll also mention that even though these were non-traditional short commentaries of 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 words, and frankly, some of the stakeholders at JMS weren't so excited we were creating this kind of potential back channel, they are among the most cited papers published in JMS through that period. So to me, the lesson there is you may be able to react relatively quickly, provide some phenomenon-based insights, and attract the attention of your scholarly colleagues all at once. So just maybe finishing my comments as I did the first round, I think we're in an absolute renaissance period for research of this sort. And there are a lot of different approaches, different methodologies. I am a big fan of thinking about events that are happening to us here and now around the world and using those as either natural experiments or quasi-experiments, and then also fulfilling this methodological expectation that is increasingly heightened around issues of identification and mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great, please.
Okay, I've got one slide to share here, and I've sort of asked myself the question: if I was trying to create a perspective or a framework for someone to engage in this type of work, what would I tell them? And I'll break it down into three main areas. The first is to be very conscious of what's going on around you, to look for and find phenomena that you are deeply interested in and spend time observing and experiencing and understanding them, to analyze them critically and to analyze them from multiple different angles, and then to think about how do you report on that. And so I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on these three things as sort of three things that I think are important. And in so doing, I'll build a little bit on things I've already said, respond a little bit to what Jonathan said, and add in a few ideas. So in observing what's going on in the world around you, whether it's events that are happening or new technologies that are emerging or new ways of working or whatever it is, I think it's useful to think about being both broad and then deciding where to go deep. You can't go, obviously, as a scholar, can't go deep on everything. And I think you need to combine in terms of where you decide to go deep, or are you intrinsically interested, curious about what's going on in that particular domain? And number two, is there some kind of reason why other scholars might be, especially on the notion that you're wanting to get published ultimately. And so you can only choose to go deep in a few areas because it takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy to do so. When you do decide to go deep, then I think it's useful to immerse yourself, and I've already elaborated on that. And you're not always going to understand as much as you need very quickly. I've found it useful to sort of take my time to understand a phenomenon and to allow it to almost unfold in front of me. And in responding to what Jonathan said, I think there are these great opportunities where something happens, we want a quick explanation or quite immediate insights, but those are almost different kinds of papers. They're quite often invited, they're quite often sort of alternative channels or alternative outlets for publishing. But I think if you're trying to use a phenomena to really evolve and extend theoretical perspectives in a fairly robust way, it typically takes a little longer. But I am a huge fan of being responsive to things that are happening and allowing management scholars to do that. In terms of analyzing, I think it's important, valuable to continually ask yourself, what theoretical anchor am I using to understand or try and explain this phenomena, to experiment and test different theoretical anchors, and to iterate what you think you're seeing and what you're explaining and what you're adding, and to not just sort of settle on your first explanation. And then in terms of reporting, be that reporting in terms of writing publications, presenting your work, and so on, I think it's important to not try and explain too much, so eliminate distractions and be willing to leave certain things out that aren't going to push your insights and your story forward. Examples and anecdotes, stories, as Sue alluded to, absolutely critical, but there's a risk there that if you're trying to develop theory, you can't just theorize from the example. You've got to actually try and elaborate and understand the mechanism and iterate back and forth with that example, and not just say, because this happened, that's what the theory is. And there's a challenge in doing that. And ultimately, what I think you're trying to do is move from the pragmatic to the conceptual, and see yourself shifting from what have I seen, understood, embraced pragmatically, and then what does that allow me to say conceptually? Because in most journals, you're still going to be held to a standard of adding something back to theory. And then the final thing I want to build on is, I think, building on what Aseem's already said, it's incredibly useful and valuable for yourself to build up a catalog of papers that do this well, especially from the reporting standpoint. It's harder to find exemplars, but when you do find them, keep a folder or file where you put all of these papers so that you've got examples that you can lean on when you're ultimately trying to do it. So that's my take on sort of the state of the art of what we should be thinking about.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah. Aseem, please.
So I don't know that I have like a whole lot of state-of-the-art approaches, but I mean, I'll make two suggestions from my own sort of experience. I think one, just building on Sue and Jonathan's point about starting with anecdotes. I'm not a big fan of anecdotes, I have to say, but I think we can take it a step further and think about starting with data, right? So we tend not to, again, our classic papers are written as, here's our theory, and then somewhere on page 17 you get to the actual data. There's no reason to do that. You could actually start. So I've done this a couple of times now where I've motivated my study by saying, I did a paper with Heather Berry back in Management Science in 2014. We started with a graph that said, here's what's happening in the real world. Wouldn't it be great if we could understand this, right? Or some of my private equity work with my former student, Paul Nary, we started with sort of just data on what's happening in private equity, how big a phenomenon that is. So I think if you're doing phenomenon-based research, I want to encourage you to sort of start by motivating it in the data and saying, here's what we're seeing. Here's some pattern that looks troubling or we can't explain. And now I'm going to try to explain that. I think the second sort of state-of-the-art approach, which I think connects to some of what Greg was talking about, is really to say, I think of it as a sort of explanation map, right? So let's think about what are all the different explanations that are out there in the literature, right? Because I think one of the pushbacks on this phenomenon-based work is that it's often atheoretical, and that's a problem. And maybe that's a problem. Maybe it's not, but certainly for publication, it's a problem. But I think one way to get around that, and I think there's some great examples. I think ASQ has published a couple of papers that are sort of abductive. Amanda Shaki had a paper. My colleague Prisha had a paper. I've done a couple of these too, where you basically start by saying, okay, here are 3 or 4 different perspectives. Here are the assumptions behind those. Here's the theory. Here's the predictions that come out of those perspectives. These are not hypotheses. These are just discriminating predictions. And then you go test these alternate explanations in the data and say, well, when we look at the actual pattern that we see, when we look at the data, when we run the regressions, the results seem most consistent with explanation 3 or explanation C rather than explanation A, B, or D. And that doesn't prove that explanation is right. It's not a test of a theory because, again, it's not hypothesis testing. But it is giving you a way to say the most plausible explanation is this, right? So I think, and again, I'm talking about doing this explicitly, but I think somewhere in the back of your mind, you want to think about what are the different explanations, what are the different assumptions that drive those explanations for this phenomena, and that will allow you to contribute back to a theory without actually starting with a theory. And I think that's really an approach that I think we're starting to see more and more people sort of adopting. And I think that's really important for some of this work.
All right. Thanks, Aseem. Great insights. Okay, so the third set of questions we have is more about the future of phenomenon-based research, and more specifically, what are your insights into the current trends and future directions for publishing phenomenon-based research? And maybe do you have any suggestions, especially for junior scholars who might be interested in doing this kind of research? So please.
So I think actually the previous speakers foreshadowed where are we going? What are some of the state-of-the-art trends? And I think a lot of it has to do with patience, immersing yourself in the phenomena. Good theory comes from a deep understanding of phenomena, even though the direction also goes the other way. And I think where we are is that context voice has become much louder. I think when we talk about shifting from deductive to maybe being more honest and reporting, that we often take a more abductive approach during the research process, that we look at our data through multiple theoretical lenses. We assess our interpretation of that pattern for practice back to the theory using a set of pragmatic criteria, which have to do with, is this interpretation situationally relevant? Is it valid in this context? Is it practically useful? And is it theoretically plausible? So is my interpretation also validated by what we think we understand about the fundamental mechanisms underlying that phenomena? So I think we are just mostly talking about it. I think as Aseem and Greg and John have pointed out, there are some great examples that have already been published in all of our top journals, and finding them and holding on to them is a really important tool in trying to build your own approach to doing phenomena-based research. One thing I'll suggest is maybe a heuristic is to think about, I was trained, deeply understand the theory, look for the gaps, go find a context where you can understand, where you can go test an interesting hypothesis about how to fill that gap. Phenomena-based research is often flips that. So think about a really interesting context, go understand the phenomena in that context, and use your insights that are very much informed by a deep understanding of the situation, the context, to develop theoretical insights. Two other things I just want to, well, I think we've ended at, it's not a rigor versus relevance anymore. It's relevant, it's rigorous relevance, I think is the future for phenomena-based research. I think if you as junior scholars can think about a research program being a quest for deep knowledge of a phenomena that you're really passionate about, you will find journals where you can publish the different forms that your knowledge claims, that your advances in our understanding of that phenomena can be published, from AMR to AMJ to AMD to AMP, and all of the other journals that are not under the AOM. There are outlets for them. AMD is a great place to take a look, and I'm happy to share the slides. I couldn't figure out how to upload the file, but just to get a sense of what are the wide range of kinds of articles that can be published that are context forward, that are phenomena based, that are not hypothesis testing. It's a great place to publish your research, but it's also a great place to look if you just are trying to get a sense of what is this thing and how do people do it.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I think you will post on the chat like the set of slides about AMD and the great work you're doing at AMD. Jonathan, please.
Thank you, Fabrice. I'm not sure I have a lot to add above and beyond what Sue and others have said, but maybe I'll just reinforce a couple points. I think first and foremost, to sustain a scholarly career, it's important to investigate something that you really care about, and likely others are going to really care about as well. I mean, that seems almost like a cliche, or it goes without saying, but I'm not sure that is always the advice and counsel we get. And I think it's unfortunate, because if we are trying to contribute knowledge and insight, having something that we care about, or as Sue said, we're passionate about, seems to me like the first relevant step. Above and beyond that, I also think that we need to be conscious that different communities may be more or less receptive to phenomenon-forward research, I'm going to call it for a moment. And I don't want to pinpoint journals, but I do think there are some journals that just by definition have signaled that they are more open and inviting to research that perhaps does not start with deep theoretical priors versus others that are not. And I guess the third and final point is that thinking about the phenomenon and all of its complex manifestations may require thinking more creatively about methodological approaches. And in my area of international business, this probably means multi-level approaches, because most IB phenomenon have kind of country or global level, macro level effects in work, in meso and micro as well. And again, years ago, that may have been kind of problematic, but now we have tools and techniques to help us greatly with those. So again, I think we're in a really nice place. I don't think that doing this kind of research is as risky as it may have been in the past. I mentioned earlier that when I receive a paper as an editor and it's not clear to me that there's a substantial contribution to something that matters in the real world, I'm much more skeptical than if there appears to be a substantial contribution to a theoretical debate which Aseem started with, that may or may not be very important or relevant. So again, I'd encourage even the young scholars to consider moving in a direction of topics and subjects that you're really passionate and excited about. And I don't think that you need to, as Sue said, sacrifice theory. It's simply that theory is used in the way that it's supposed to be used, which is to support understanding a real world problem or challenge, and not as an end in and of itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great, please.
Thank you. So I've only I wanted to spend a little bit of time just doubling down on the idea that even a journal like AMR, where it's conceptual papers, so it's not anchored on empirical work that's been done, there has been quite a lot of openness and receptiveness to the idea of starting from a phenomenon or from something that you've observed, some event that's happened, some technology that's emerged, and so on. I think doubling down on Susan's point that there are so many different outlets, but each one of them requires slightly different framing, setup, and what you then do with what you've understood from that phenomenon. There are slightly different sort of formulas for each. And I just wanted to reinforce the idea that, I spent 3 years as an AE at AMR. And for me, many of the most interesting papers had some kind of relationship back to some phenomenon that was happening in the real world. And based on that, we wrote an editorial, which I've put on the screen there, which Fabrice referred to earlier. But then even more recently, just over a month ago, Paul Tracy, who's one of the AEs there now, did a session which you can go and see on YouTube. And this is for those who are particularly interested in trying to say, how do I write a conceptual paper, purely conceptual paper, that has a phenomenon-based orientation, starts from a phenomena? And I do think there are important things to take into account in terms of ultimately allowing the explanation of that phenomena to contribute back to theory, because that's a high bar and a standard you will be held to quite heavy effect at AMR. And so recognizing that sometimes you might be forced to actually start with some element of theory, then go to the phenomena, then go back to theory, is sort of what we see there. But there are those opportunities that exist, and I think there's more and more receptiveness to doing that kind of work at somewhere like AMR. That's it from me.
All right, so thanks, Greg. Aseem, please.
Okay. I guess I think thinking about the future, I think the big thing I see happening in the field is I think we're increasingly interested in building cumulative knowledge. So it's not just about, each paper doesn't necessarily stand on its own. I think this connects back to Jonathan's sort of point about careers. And so I think so on the one hand, I think that creates a lot of opportunities for work that is, replicating existing studies, providing sort of additional empirics and providing additional data, not just trying to come up with a new theoretical explanation. Not that that's not useful as well, but it also creates challenges. And I think the big thing I see changing in our field is just the level of transparency that we are now asking from authors, right? And transparency in 3 senses. One, I think, is transparency around the actual data that goes into your studies, right? So many journals now have management science and SMJ now have policies where you are required to provide data disclosure. Even if you don't provide it publicly, you need to provide it to the editor. Management science has a methods editor who will actually rerun all your regressions to make sure they're correct. ASQ just put in a new policy on data disclosure. So I think we're seeing a movement towards, for those of us who are more on the empirical side, I think we're seeing a much bigger movement to saying we really want to know this is correct and we want to be able to replicate it and we want to see the code and we want to see. And I think that's a great thing, but I think it does actually boost the importance of understanding the phenomena and understanding the context, what you're doing. Second, I think there's a lot more transparency around just showing us the data and just showing us what's actually happening with the phenomenon rather than, right? So I mean, again, I think our sort of standard format was, table one was correlations and table two was like the regression table, and that was all you saw. I think we're trying to move away from that and saying, show us the bin scatter plots, show us the distribution of the frequencies, show us where does the variance in your sample actually come from. Show us kind of just in the raw data, do you see it in the tabulated data, do you see the pattern that you're thinking of? And if your data only shows up if your result only shows up if you use some crazy instrument, that's probably not a good sign, right? So I think just being more, and I think that's particularly important for phenomenon-based research, because for God's sake, if you're trying to understand the phenomena, let's understand the phenomena. Don't give me a regression coefficient, right? And I think part of that is also just understanding economic magnitudes a lot more. So I think just a much greater emphasis on being transparent about what is the actual size and is it really happening in the real world? And then finally, I think just transparency about specifications, right? So Andy King, Brent Goldfarb, and Tim Simcoe had this lovely AMR piece about learning from quantitative research, where they sort of laid out this kind of epistemic maps. And I've tried to adopt those in a couple of my papers. They haven't got published yet, but hopefully they will soon. And actually, SMJ recently published a paper by DK where they actually create a separate website where you can go play with the different specifications, right? So, but I think the point is, rather than showing us one specification, show us all the different specifications, be transparent, be honest about it. And it's okay if some of the specifications don't work. We want to understand under what conditions don't they work and under what conditions do they work. I think similarly, we're looking for more transparency around clustering of standard errors, right? It used to be, you just said, oh, my standard errors are robust and that was enough. Now we want to know how you're clustering standard errors, and there's a lot of new initiatives there. So I think just being much, much more transparent so that we can actually build cumulative knowledge and really understand what's happening with the phenomena is where I see the field heading. And I think that's both an opportunity and a challenge for future scholars.
Thanks, Aseem, and thanks to all the participants, for sharing your experience and for your great insights. So now let me turn to Koen for the Q&As. Koen, please.
Thank you very much, panelists, for these great sets of thoughts. Very interesting to look back, present, and to the future on this on the publishing of phenomenon-based research. Can I kindly go back to some of the interesting questions that were posted and share some of this with you? So Jacqueline is asking, can we share some insights on what are your views as panelists on using the phenomenon-based research? And particularly the phenomenography approach by Sandberg, which I think is one key approach to studying phenomena, as well as the case study research approach by Eisenhardt, and perhaps other qual type approaches to do this type of research. Can you reflect on some of the particular methods that you feel are appropriate or relevant to reflect on? Anyone to share thoughts on that?
I mean, I can tell you that AMD is method agnostic. So I think it's, your choice of method is going to depend on what you want to understand about the phenomena. And, and to some degree, you have flexibility in how you want to understand it. Also, what kind of theoretical inferences you're looking to draw. So I can't say there's a preference for a particular method. I think data transparency in that method, and then being conscious of ultimately we want it to inform theory and practice. How is it going to do that? And are you comfortable with that?
I mean, I'll comment on the Eisenhardt case study research perspective, because I've done a little bit of that myself and experimented with it and so on. And I think that there's a natural pairing there, because in particular, the way she recommends doing it, where you select your cases and you select your cases for particular reasons, it's almost invariable that there's something interesting about different cases or some aspect of different cases that makes them comparable. And so, and that's invariably based on something that you can observe about those cases. So there's clearly a strong link there. I can't comment as much about phenomenography or the Sandberg approach. I'm just not as familiar.
I mean, I will just add that, and this is in some ways not really answering your question, I'm sorry, but I think part of what I think is really interesting about this kind of working, because I think a lot of the case study work involves working with like specific companies, working with specific, getting really deep into an organization. And I think one of the exciting things we're seeing now is the opportunity to push beyond just observing to actually, doing field experiments or doing other kinds of. So, I mean, I think this also speaks to the sort of breadth of methods that we can use in these areas. If you do have the kind of access to a company where you can really do an ethnography, I think you can push beyond just observe. I mean, the old sort of ethnography work was really, I'm going to be a silent observer and just watch what happens, which is useful and, valuable, and I'm not dismissing it. But I think there's increasing the opportunities, and I think, in my experience, firms are hungry for people to come in and say, hey, I want to run a A/B test, or I want to run some sort of field experiment, or I want to put in an intervention that can actually both, again, to the vigor versus relevance, it's both extremely vigorous, but also extremely relevant, because you're actually doing stuff that is really impacting real people on the ground. And so I think we're seeing more and more of that work, and I think that's an opportunity as well.
Thanks so much, Aseem. Any other thoughts from anyone? I think there's also from one of the panelists. I don't want to preclude or exclude any thoughts here. There's also a very interesting other question, if time allows, and if I could, Greg or Jonathan, would you like to add any to what's been said prior, or
just very quick, very briefly? I just support what has been said before. At JMS, we had I think a reputation for publishing a fair amount of qualitative research. And indeed, a couple of years ago, our best paper, which was also the RRBM's best paper, was really an ethnography around crowdfunding of a social venture. And it really had, I think, all the elements of what we've been discussing here in terms of, intellectually interesting, speaking to a real world phenomenon. Also, something I meant to mention earlier, which is combining some perspectives from outside of traditional management studies with more conventional management studies constructs or variables. I think that's another interesting approach to phenomena-based research. So just to support the notion that I think phenomena-based research is agnostic about methods, but that these qualitative approaches, I think, can really provide a rich and really deep understanding of a particular phenomenon.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Is it Greg? Would you like to join in? Shall I move to the other question, which I think is what works for you?
Please, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one interesting question here is also around the notion of how do you examine and explore more explicitly observable types of phenomena versus more implicit ones, right? So this question is coming in by Jugo Lee. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And giving examples around earnings management or studying greenwashing, other types of phenomena that may be less explicit for our direct study. Do you want to share any thoughts or experiences on that particular question? Love to hear any thoughts.
I can go first. So I think two things that are helpful. I mean, obviously, studying things that are that people don't want you to see is hard, right? I don't think it's really about implicit or explicit. I think it's about covert, right? People don't want to acknowledge that, they're. So I think this is where phenomenon-based research can actually be very helpful, because I think there's opportunities where, things become evident accidentally, right? So, Jordan Siegel has some really nice work, recent work thinking about corruption, which uses the fact that after a regime change, sometimes corruption becomes evident. Or Eileen Gatinon has some really nice work about corruption in Brazil. So, those are the kinds of things that you can study when something, or Tim Werner at UT Austin has some really nice work thinking about political donations, where, these records become publicly available suddenly, and you can actually see things that people didn't want you to see. And so I think, again, this is why it's important to understand the phenomenon, because I think if you're paying attention, you can actually, recognize these opportunities. I think the other thing is that for a lot of these things, I think you can actually observe patterns that in the data that line up with sort of misbehavior, even if people won't actually acknowledge that, right? So for example, in some of my own work, right, we were trying to I mean, so I have this 2018 paper where we argued that firms that gave more to philanthropy would also do bad things, right? And then how do you observe that? Well, we can actually observe oil spills, right? And oil spills have to be reported to the government. And so we can actually observe, no oil firm will ever say, yeah, we donated a bunch of money and we did it because we wanted to spill more oil. But we can actually see what happens, immediately after they give donations in a particular region. Do the oil spills go up? And we can distinguish between oil spills caused by natural events versus lack of maintenance, because all of that is recorded. So I think there are often ways, I think this is why it's important to really get into the context. Once you actually understand the context, you can actually pretty easily find, I don't know if easy, you can often find opportunities to observe things that are covert, but you can't download them from CompuStat, right? So you have to really get into the phenomenon and understand what's going on. But when you do that, I think there are always opportunities, and I think those are actually some of the richest opportunities to do research, because again, those papers really kind of have a lot to contribute.
The other thing that's important here is this is where patience often pays off to some extent, because it often takes time for some of these unobservables to become observable. Either it's through litigation or through regulation or through the request for public disclosures and so on. And so if you're interested in a phenomenon, greenwashing or something else, you very often learn in retrospect who the greenwashers are. And if you've been paying attention to stuff that's happening in a particular industry or domain pertaining to that, there's more so than ever now, there's often paper trails or data trails of what they did over time that you can then uncover and unpack. But it does take dedication, time, and a deep interest in a particular domain to, number one, know what those data trails look like, to know, number two, what different firms and other actors are doing in those spaces, and to, number three, pay attention to when things are ultimately disclosed or you find things out. So I think it's an example of that idea of patience and being attuned to what's happening in a particular space gives you an advantage in terms of ultimately using that space as a basis to theorize and understand what's happened.
If I could just quickly pick up on what Aseem said and what Greg said, I think building on the idea of patience and looking at things from different perspectives while you're while you're struggling to get to the right way to capture the phenomena, be talking to practitioners, be talking to people in that space, be talking to people with different methodological skills, talk to people in other disciplines, because they will all have different ways of understanding and getting at phenomena that are difficult to capture, and mechanisms behind the phenomena as well. So just have diverse conversations within and outside academia.
I would just add, related to this point, but also our earlier conversation, I think sometimes in management, we are a little too conservative in the range of data and variables we might be interested in. So one of my streams is really in sustainability, and there's a lot of interesting data coming from the natural sciences that are appropriate ways to think about and measure not what companies say they're doing with respect to CSR and sustainability, but the actual on-the-ground impacts in terms of toxicity or deforestation or whatever it may be. So one of my other agendas is really to advance management research with societal impact. And I think here we've not fully explored all the possibilities of importing some interesting data sources, of which there are, myriad from our allied social sciences, but especially even natural sciences.
Great set of thoughts, Alice. Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts on the question of implicit versus explicit types of phenomena, and also detailing how you would go about doing that, topics that are and phenomena that are more covert. So I think there is there is one question still also around data transparency relative to qualitative data that I like to bring forth if time allows, and before I give a short set of short recap of some of the key thoughts that you've been sharing. Once again, thanks so much for that. Is there a relative to data transparency? I think there is a question that's the point that Aseem was also earlier pointing to. I think some of it was particularly pertaining to quant data. If I recall that well, Aseem, would you reflect, and maybe others as well, clearly, on is there similar types of requests for transparency and wishes relative to qual types of interview data?
So I admit I'm not an expert in qualitative work, but my sense is yes. I think there's been a lot of push I think there's been a lot of debates about, I'm not really following them, but my sense is there's been a bunch of debates about, what kind of reporting. I mean, first of all, I think qualitative work has always been, pushing more for transparency, because I think it's always important to sort of, provide the raw data, the interviews, etc. I think that trend has been increasing. I know for a while there was a call. I don't think we went through with that, but I think there was a call for, providing videos of all the interviews you did, etc. At least, and again, not necessarily making them public, but certainly making them available to. So I think I think we are seeing increasing transparency in that area as well. I think the other thing that is going to make that I expect to see more of in that space as well, is one, I think more transparency around who you're talking to and who you're not talking to, right? I think the days when you could say we talked to 10 executives and we don't need to tell you who those executives, I mean, we don't need to tell you who we didn't talk to. I think those days are coming to a close, is my sense. I also think the other big area of transparency, and this is true for both quantitative, qualitative work, is around the use of AI. So, we just, I think SMS just put out a policy saying, if you're going to use ChatGPT or other language models, you need to be, to write your paper, you have to acknowledge that. I think that's going to be an issue for both quantitative and qualitative work, because at this point, how do I know that the interviews you're generating are not generated by a bot? And bots hallucinate all the time. So I think I do think there's going to be, so I don't have a specific, okay, this is exactly what the standard is, but I think if you're doing qualitative work, you need to be very cautious about transparency in that space as well.
Do any of the other three panelists who wish to add here one thought, or are we moving to round off? Any final thoughts that you may wish to share? Any of the panelists, please do.
I mean, I'll just I just want to reflect on one of the other questions there, just about how do you learn this? And I think one of the important factors is that it's not a paint by numbers approach. Each phenomenon is different. It requires attacking it slightly differently. And so if you've done one thing in one domain, it might not be the same in the next domain. And as a result, it's almost always like a bit of a bricolage approach in terms of the methods you use, the data you gather, how you assemble that, how you analyze that, and how you report that. And so each project is somewhat different, meaning that it's hard to have this sort of very sort of paint by numbers or regimented approach as to how this is done, which is what we might see with hypothesis testing. And so you've got to be open to learning, to experimenting, and to having the sort of bricolage orientation to making all of this happen, which can be a little intimidating as a more junior scholar, but it certainly is rich and exciting in terms of developing and ultimately publishing this work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Given that we have 1 minute left. Sorry, Aseem?
I just want to also add, just to respond to that. I think Fabrice put up a bunch of slides with a lot of these editorials. I personally find my colleague Andy Vanderwent's book on engaged scholarship to be really useful as a guide to doing this kind of work. So I strongly recommend that to people. And Andy also put, a whole set of, he used to teach a course on this, and that course is available online. So if you're interested, you can go take a look at that.
I think that's a great thought, Aseem, and Andy's book abductive research indeed is a great starting point. Thanks for reminding us of his wonderful contributions in that field too. I wish to kind of, I have a wonderful, at least, I have attempted to make a, sum up of everything that you said here in terms of, to secure time and timely finishing. Let me kind of, just give, a few, one-liners here on the wonderful contributions that you've made as panelists here. I think, moving, back to the, to historically to the present and the future, I think you've really offered a great set of thoughts with Sue, coming in as, we're starting with rigor versus relevance, right? And now moving towards, an era where, rigorous relevance is particularly, emphasized, coming up with situational relevance, practical utility, and theoretically plausible types of studies. I think also one of the thoughts that Jonathan emphasized was, let's try and avoid, continuing to out-theorize our colleagues in finance and economics, for instance, but instead, look at, opportunities that current methods and current types of new multi-level studies may offer. This is just, I'm taking snapshots here without doing full justice. But, I think Greg emphasizing the need to stop being and focusing on fetish around grounding in theory. Let's focus more on trying to be productive, much, as Darwin's work has inspired us to do, coming out with very rich insights that are drawn from phenomena, which, particularly time and effort and to indulge, right? So I think Greg rightly pointed out the need to observe and go back and forth between observing and analyzing. Aseem, great set of thoughts too, right? Really reflecting on, the significance that messy findings can offer, right? And starting with that messiness as a motivation, whether that's through graphing or other means, to try and work towards more rich and plausible explanations that then offer, and may inform theory eventually, is something that will, hopefully we'll see more of in the future. I have lots of questions here that I also love to point out and start to share with our panelists, but I think it is time for me to say a big thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants. Fabrice, co-organizing with you was an absolute joy. I leave the final word to you, Fabrice, but from my end, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists and the audience as well. Thank you, Koen, as well.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.